In the summer of 1845, two majestic ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, sailed into Lancaster Sound, their holds packed with 3 years of provisions and their decks lined with 129 of Britain's finest naval officers and men. They were embarking on the most ambitious Arctic expedition of the century, to chart the final uncharted link of the Northwest Passage. But by 1848, every single one of them was dead. No distress signal was ever sent. No survivor ever told the full story. For over a decade, the fate of the Franklin expedition remained one of the greatest mysteries of the age. What began as a triumph of Victorian ambition ended in a catastrophe so complete that even today, the ice yields only fragments of their final agonizing days. The ships were found decades later, entombed in the deep, but the men had vanished into the white silence. This is the story of how 129 men walked into the Arctic and never walked out. The mid-19th century was the golden age of Arctic exploration, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity, national pride, and the promise of a lucrative trade route. The British Admiralty had offered a 20,000-pound reward, equivalent to over $2 million today, for the first successful navigation of the Northwest Passage. Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old veteran of 3 previous Arctic expeditions, was chosen to lead. He was a national hero, but also a man past his prime, prone to stubbornness and over-reliance on outdated methods. His ships were state-of-the-art, reinforced with heavy iron plating, equipped with steam engines and central heating, and stocked with 8,000 tins of preserved food, 4,000 gallons of rum, and a library of 1,200 books. The expedition was a symbol of Victorian confidence in technology and empire. But beneath the veneer of preparation lurked fatal flaws that would turn the ships into floating coffins. On May 19, 1845, the Erebus and Terror departed from Greenhithe, England, cheered by crowds and saluted by naval guns. The crew included 24 officers and 105 men, many of whom had never sailed in ice before. Franklin's second-in-command, Captain Francis Crozier of the Terror, was a seasoned polar explorer, but his Irish background and blunt demeanor kept him out of favor. The ships carried a band, a hand organ, and even a printing press, tools to stave off boredom during the long winters. They sailed via Greenland, where 5 men were discharged for illness, leaving 129 to continue. The last European eyes to see them were those of a whaling ship captain, who reported the expedition anchored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to clear. They were in high spirits. One officer wrote home, "We are all in the best of health and full of hope." That hope would evaporate within 2 years, swallowed by the silent, indifferent ice. The first signs of trouble were subtle. In the summer of 1845, the expedition sailed into Lancaster Sound and then south into Peel Sound, a route that had been recommended by the Arctic explorer John Rae, but which Franklin initially rejected. Rae had warned that the ice in Peel Sound was notoriously treacherous, but Franklin, confident in his ship's iron-reinforced bows, pressed on. By September, the ice closed in, trapping the ships off King William Island. The men settled in for winter, unaware that they would never escape. The supplies were abundant, but the tinned food, sold by a contractor named Stephen Goldner, was defectively sealed. Lead solder leached into every meal. The men began to suffer from lead poisoning, causing fatigue, confusion, and paralysis. Meanwhile, the weather was worse than expected. Temperatures plunged to minus 48 degrees Celsius. The ice that held them was not seasonal. It was multi-year pack ice, thick as a fortress. The ships were locked in a prison that would never melt. During the first winter, the men maintained a semblance of routine. They held church services, performed plays, and published a newspaper called the Illustrated Arctic News. Officers took scientific readings. The crew played football on the ice. But the lead poisoning was already eroding their health. By spring 1846, the ice showed no sign of breaking. Franklin ordered the ships to be sawn out of the ice, a back-breaking effort that moved them only a few miles south before they were frozen again. The expedition was now trapped for a second winter. The library of 1,200 books offered escape, but the cold seeped into everything. Men began to die. The first to go were the weakest, those with scurvy or lead-induced infections. Franklin himself fell ill. On June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died, his body buried in the frozen ground. Command passed to Crozier, who now faced an impossible choice: wait for a rescue that might never come, or abandon the ships and march south across the ice. By April 1848, the situation was desperate. 24 men had already died. The ships remained locked in ice, their hulls crushed and leaking. Crozier made the fateful decision: abandon the vessels and march south toward Back River, a route that might lead to the Hudson's Bay Company trading posts. On April 22, 1848, 105 survivors set out, dragging heavy sledges loaded with lifeboats and supplies. They were weak, sick, and confused from lead poisoning. The terrain was a nightmare: pressure ridges, open leads, and soft snow. They carried a message, later found in a cairn, that coldly stated, "All well." It was a lie. They were barely alive. The decision to march was the final nail. Had they stayed, they might have survived longer, perhaps until rescue. But the march exposed them to the elements, exhausted their remaining strength, and scattered them across the barren landscape. Their fate was now sealed by their own desperate hope. The march became a death crawl. Men dropped from exhaustion and were left behind. Some wandered off, hallucinating from lead poisoning and scurvy. The Inuit later reported seeing starving men staggering along the coast, their clothes rotted, their eyes hollow. The survivors resorted to eating the leather from their boots and the bones of their dead comrades. In one of the most shocking discoveries, a search party in 1859 found a boat on a sledge, laden with silver cutlery, china, and silk handkerchiefs, luxuries that had no survival value. The boat contained 2 skeletons, one with a loaded musket. Nearby, a heap of human bones bore unmistakable signs of cannibalism. The men had been reduced to butchering their own. The Victorian public was horrified. The image of British naval officers gnawing on the bones of their shipmates shattered the myth of civilized exploration. In that frozen hell, all order dissolved. The last survivors likely died within miles of a cache of provisions they never reached. The peak of horror came not from a single event, but from the slow, grinding realization that no one was coming. The men who reached King William Island's shores found no game, no shelter. They died where they fell. In 1854, the Inuit told explorer John Rae that they had seen 40 men dragging a boat across the ice, and later found their bodies, some with the flesh cut from the bones. Rae's report, which included accounts of cannibalism, was met with outrage in England. Lady Franklin, Sir John's widow, refused to believe it. She funded a final search that uncovered the boat and the skeletons, confirming the worst. But the true depth of the horror was only revealed in the 1980s, when forensic scientists exhumed bodies from 3 graves on Beechey Island. The bodies were perfectly preserved in permafrost. Autopsies showed massive lead levels, 10 times the normal amount. The men had been poisoned by their own tinned food. The expedition was doomed before it began, by a contractor's greed and a commander's pride. In the aftermath, the Franklin expedition became a legend. Dozens of search parties, including one led by the doomed himself, Robert McClure, finally charted the Northwest Passage, though McClure's crew also faced starvation and rescue. But Franklin's men were never found alive. The last confirmed sighting of a survivor was by Inuit in 1850, who encountered a group of emaciated men near Starvation Cove. One officer was still alive, but unable to walk. The Inuit offered help, but the men refused, perhaps fearing hostility. They died within days. The final chapter was written in 2014 and 2016, when Parks Canada discovered the wrecks of Erebus and Terror, perfectly preserved in the cold waters of the Arctic. The ships were found exactly where Inuit oral tradition had said they would be. The discovery closed a 170-year mystery, but it also raised new questions. Why did the men not hunt? Why did they stay so close to the ships? And why did they refuse Inuit aid? The Franklin expedition remains a cautionary tale about the limits of technology and the dangers of hubris. It cost the British government over £600,000, tens of millions today, and the lives of 129 men. It also transformed Arctic exploration, forcing future expeditions to adopt Inuit survival techniques and to question the wisdom of rigid naval hierarchy. The story has inspired novels, songs, and the hit TV series, The Terror. But the real horror is not the cannibalism or the cold. It is the quiet, creeping tragedy of men who followed orders into a frozen grave, their captain's miscalculations compounded by a faulty canning process. They vanished not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, bewildered decline. Today, their bones still lie scattered on the shores of King William Island, a silent monument to Victorian ambition. If you want to see more stories of doomed expeditions and the dark side of exploration, subscribe and hit the bell. The ice holds many secrets, and we have only scratched the surface.